Hello Math 10 students. In this video we're going to take a look at section 2.7, adding and subtracting fractions. This is probably the most involved part of chapter 2, so I'd encourage you to make sure that you get plenty of practice with this particular section. So to begin with, we're going to take a look at the sum on the top. The directions here will typically say something along the lines of find the sum, and we've got the fractions 2/5 plus 3/4. I'm writing the fractions vertically here because it's a little bit easier to add and subtract fractions when you see them written vertically. But you might see this written out as 2/5 plus 3/4 horizontally this way. I encourage you to rewrite it vertically. It makes it a little bit easier to work with. So here's our process for adding and subtracting fractions. The very first thing that you're going to need to do is find a common denominator for both of those fractions. I'm going to take a look at the two denominators of 5 and 4 and see if I can find a common multiple of both of those fractions. A common denominator cannot be smaller than either of the two fractions. It has to be a multiple of both of them. So I'm looking at multiples of 5 and multiples of 4. If in doubt, you can always just multiply both your denominators. That won't always get you the least common denominator, but it will always get you a common denominator. And in spite of what you might read in some textbooks, it doesn't always have to be the least common denominator. Any common denominator will do. So here 5 times 4 is 20, and that just so happens to be the lowest common denominator. So I'm going to use 20 as my common denominator. So my common denominator here is 20. You can also get this by listing out the multiples of 5 and the multiples of 4, or by using the multiplication table that's in the week 2 overview. So I need to next rewrite both of these fractions so that they have a denominator of 20. That's my second step. I'm going to convert both fractions to equivalent fractions that have that common denominator. So 2/5 is going to equal some fraction over 20. But I can't just bring the 2 over. 2/5 is not the same thing as 2/20. And the same thing with 3/4. It's going to be something over 20, but I can't just bring the 3 over. 3/20 is pretty small, but 3/4 is more than a half, so those two things are not equal. What's my process here? It's kind of the opposite of reducing to lowest terms here. Instead of dividing the top and bottom of the fraction by the same thing, I'm going to multiply by the same thing. I'm going to try to multiply by a common factor. So what can I multiply 5 by to get 20? In other words, 5 times what is 20? Well, 4, right? So I can multiply the top and bottom by 4 here. Another way to think about this is I divide going across the bottom here, 20 divided by 5, and then I multiply the top by the result. So 20 divided by 5 gives me 4, and I'll multiply 2 times 4, and that'll get me a new numerator of 8 up here. So you're dividing the denominators and then multiplying the result by the numerator. Let's try it out on the bottom here. I'm dividing backwards, so this is really 20 divided by 4, and that gives me a 5, which means I can multiply 3 by 5 and get a numerator of 15. 3/4 is equal to 15/20, and if you were to reduce 15/20 to lowest terms, you'd get 3/4 back. Similarly, 2/5 is equal to 8/20. Our last step here is to just add or subtract the denominators, or the numerators rather, and then keep that common denominator. So I'm going to take a look at this addition problem. I'm going to add the 8 and the 15, and when I add 8 and 15, that's going to give me 23. So I get 23, and I keep that same common denominator of 20. Last but not least, it's always good to check to see if you can reduce that to lowest terms. There's nothing that I can divide 23 by. It's a prime number. 20 can be divided by 2 and 4 and 5 and 10, but none of those are going to go into 23. So this is my final answer, 23/20. Let's take a look at this bottom question. I need to find a common denominator for 8 and 12. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can come up with a common denominator for both of those. Remember, if in doubt, you can always multiply them out. Did you find one? Well, if we multiply 8 by 12, we'll get 96, and that works just fine. 96 is a perfectly good common denominator for this one, but there is an easier common denominator to work with, something that's a little bit smaller. If you want to, go ahead and see if you can find it if you didn't find it already. You can use the multiplication table again in the week 2 overview. And a good multiple of 8 that's also a multiple of 12 would be 24. So I'm going to go ahead and use 24 as my common denominator for this one. My common denominator here is 24. It just so happens to be the least common denominator as well. If that took too long for you to find and you'd rather, you can always also use 96. You could just multiply 8 times 12. And 48 would work too. There's a lot of options here. But I'll go ahead and use 24. So these are both going to be equal to blank over 24. And now my next step is I have to find the new numerators. Remember, I can't just bring 7 and 5 over. I've got to divide the denominators and then multiply the result by the numerator. Again, go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out those numerators on your own. Alright, let's see if you got them right. 24 divided by 8 is 3. So 8 goes into 24 3 times. In other words, I'd have to multiply 8 by 3 to get 24. That means on top, I'm multiplying 7 by 3, and I'll get a 21 up here. 12 goes into 24 twice. So when I divide the bottoms, I get 2. That means I'm going to multiply 5 times 2 and get 10 upstairs. Now, I see that this is a subtraction sign here, or a minus sign. I like to bring that over with the second fraction, and typically it goes with the numerator because you are adding or subtracting the numerators. Addition and subtraction work exactly the same way. Just pay attention to the sign in front of each fraction. The sign to the left of a number sticks with that number, so this negative sign here is going to belong to the 10/24ths, and again, it is going to stick to the numerator here. So 21 minus 10 should give me 11. So my final answer here will be 11 over 24. Now I say final answer, I do have to double check to make sure that that's in lowest terms, and it just so happens that it is. I can't divide anything into 11 other than 11 and 1, so it's a prime number. So I just have to check, and 11 doesn't go into 24, so that is in lowest terms. To summarize the process for adding and subtracting fractions, it is a 3-step process, and it's pretty long, so make sure you practice it. First step is to look at the two denominators and find a common denominator. The multiplication table in the week 2 overview is super helpful for that, so is just knowing your times tables. But if it's taking you a long time to do that, just multiply the two denominators and that will work. Next, you have to convert fractions to equivalent fractions. This step 2 is probably where I see more mistakes than anything else, so make sure you focus on this one. You're dividing across the two denominators backwards, and then you multiply the result by the numerator. It's one way of thinking about it, at least. And then last but not least, you're going to add or subtract the two numerators. Make sure to bring your signs over so that you're doing the right sign rules.